One of the things I learned so far today was actually while John Mack might have been chairman of the year, I'm not sure is that an official title he's been given, but he's never been asked to sum up a conference at the end, basically because you couldn't give him the mic with an unlimited amount of time, So I'm actually very honoured to get that role later on today. So ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to have a fantastic session to end what's been a brilliant conference. The topic is resilience, okay, and what year better than 2018 to actually test our resilience as individuals and test the resilience of our farming businesses. So a really, really relevant topic. And two fantastic speakers. I'm going to firstly introduce Brendan Horan, who's a researcher based in Moore Park, running a dairy farming business at home. And Brendan brings a wonderful mix of understanding best practice international research with a very, very practical background. So I'll hand over to Brendan.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Seeing as I got a fair few questions this morning, I'm just going to get my presentation out of the way and leave the questions for Nolik for the rest of the day. Just, I suppose, in terms of the topic, am I going the wrong way? Yeah, I suppose just I have a slight concern in terms of the word resilience. We can be talking about jargon, in ways to. So really, I suppose, what I want to achieve for the next 20 minutes is where are we now in terms of Irish dairy farmers, pasture-based dairy farmers? What's our situation? What do we need to be focused on? And what in research are we doing to try and address some of the issues that we see in front of us? And hopefully we'll get out of that a better understanding of what we're doing and where we're going. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, it's the context where we are at the moment, what information is available, a strategy then for resilient dairying, feeding on what the lads have talked about a bit earlier, some of the characteristics, and then some future improvement areas that are a central focus for us in terms of research. So I suppose to start off, it might surprise you, but from an information point of view, I would argue strongly that there has never been a better time to be a grass-based dairy farmer. And I'll put it to you because of growing incomes in developing economies, increased urban centres around the world, extended life expectancy. There's a growing demand for animal-based dairy products, okay? And while if you look at Twitter, you look at Joe Duffy or I don't know who the UK comparison to Joe Duffy is, but anyway, some of these talk shows on radio, whatever, you might believe that there's no future for the products that you produce, where in actual fact it's quite the opposite. As economies develop and as people have more disposable income, they want more animal proteins. And that's actually also happening in Western societies, not to mind these developing economies. And two reports out just in the last couple of months. One is the FAO report, shows that in comparison with the last 10 years where we've had significant growth in terms of dairy in the world markets and so on, that's actually going to continue for the next 10 years. And they would add to that there'll be a bigger focus on higher quality products as well. So while there's a growing demand for animal proteins, and in particular for dairy, there's actually going to be a premium for quality products in the future. There's an EU Outlook report out looking ahead to 2030. That's just out, published since December. And again, the same story. Growing demand for the types of products you produced. Middle East, North Africa, these are the kind of developing economies now that are increasingly interested in what you're producing. It's a very, very solid base on which in terms of demand is growing for your products. Every conference that I go to now, or often people talk about vegans or flexitarians or some other cohort of people who are interested in or specific group of interested in nutrition, I suppose. But across all of that, you're definitely dealing with more engaged consumers. Okay, and actually I see that as a strength and something for us to work with, because the type of products we produce, and I'm going to show you more information on that, are premium products. They're premium products in terms of quality and nutrition. And actually, people being more focused on quality products is actually an advantage for pasture-based dairy producers. So I see that as a real strength going forward, and I might elaborate on that. And also there's increasing recognition of the benefits of grassland farming. So I suppose last year I was the science advisor for the European Grassland Conference, and it was just striking, and maybe it was a bad sign for me, but when you look across Europe and look at the kind of the science that's coming out now, European dairy industries that give their right arm to have the Irish grassland systems, and they advocate those systems all the time to their farmers, even though they can't grow anything like the quantities of grass that you can grow. and they can't utilize grass at anything like the rates that you can utilize grass. And that's with very good reason, and that is that from an environmental perspective, you have the best production system, the best natural advantage to utilize nutrients to produce product in a really efficient way that's better, that's good for everyone. So a little bit that story has been lost in terms of the media and so on, and we need to do a better job definitely in telling people about our systems and what they do and what they don't do. And also there's an increasing capacity to produce food. So just in terms of reviewing some of that information, it might surprise you to know that like the productivity of dairy cows in Ireland has doubled since the late 1970s. And that's a huge change. And a lot of that has occurred even in the last 10 years, and I showed that information yesterday. So while, you know, yes, we're not producing any quantities of grass at greater levels compared to maybe maize or other feeds, that's for sure. But at the same time, there is productivity gain in terms of grassland-based dairying. And also, I think if you look at it in a holistic way in terms of competitiveness, I actually think in terms of what people are looking for and how we produce it and how efficient it is and how environmentally sustainable it is, we're actually becoming more and more competitive all the time in contradiction to these other industries. So a lot of good news there, I suppose, to focus on. But there are challenges, and no more so than the price that we're paid for our product and how variable it is. And I know you've seen many of these graphs many, many times. I've just brought it up to date to the end of 18. The price of product now we get is totally variable. And I suppose the bigger impact of that is in terms of the profitability of your farms. So that what's unique here, George Ramsbottom has taken a matched sample of dairy farmers that supplied information to him between the years 2008 and 2014, across a range of milk prices, across a range of climatic conditions, and from that data, same farms across those years, he showed that the variation in farm profit was from around 400 euros per hectare at 23 cent a litre to about 1,400 euros a hectare at 39 cent a litre. Massive variability, broadly outside of your control in terms of, you know, it's a factor mainly that you don't control the price you're paid for your product in terms of the market price at least. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to farm in a way that allows us to manage at least that when milk prices are below average or low, that we are capable of making a profit, you know, as family businesses and so on. I suppose the other challenges in terms of the environmental side, the biodiversity and so on, and there's a lot of reports coming out now showing that there is a loss of biodiversity. We can argue about the climate change, and there's lots of people who will, but in terms of, I suppose, from a food point of view, Ireland is one of the most food-secure countries in the world. We produce enough food for about 35 million people. Okay, so that's pretty much the extreme. But even among the other secure food countries such as the US, Australia and so on, you know, climate change is having a very real impact on their ability to produce food. And it's seen even if you look at, you know, how much milk is being produced now, when the weather changes, a big impact on their capability to produce food. So it is a real issue. Globally, there's loss of biodiversity, increased issues in terms of pollution, soil erosion and so on, and food and feed competition. So using feeds for other reasons other than just for feeding ruminants, whether it be for for methane production or for biogas or whatever, there is increased competition for feed. And so these are all challenges. And as was rightly mentioned through this conference over the last few days, the societal, I suppose, impression of what we do and how well we do it is crucially important. And I suppose the way I see that is in terms of, you know, the non-food product benefits that we have to deliver. We have to deliver high standard environment. We have to deliver in terms of animal welfare and in terms of product quality. We cannot afford to have, you know, big compromises in terms of any of those things. And those are real challenges for us day to day and in the long term. And as an expanding industry, it's like a flag there, you know, in terms of what are you doing about these challenges. So, you know, it's more than just about producing more food. So to state the challenge then in its real terms, in terms of research at least, it's about producing more food from, I suppose, products that are not edible by humans. So grassland covers 60% of the world agricultural area, or 90% of Irish agricultural area. That is unusable by humans in terms of, at least, I don't know too many that eat it anyway. And as such, you know, it's about converting that efficiently to product. And, you know, we could plow it all up, but there would be other big consequences to that in terms of environmental problems and so on. So, you know, there are hard choices to be made here, but there are, you know, we have to make the right choices in terms of this sustainability challenge. and doing it in a way that doesn't compromise on any of the issues that I've identified earlier. The good news is, though, that when you look across all the research and the European research and other places, that the grass-based systems you have are best place of any type of system you could have to meet those challenges. So that's very, very important. And again, probably not reflected in terms of the national conversation about these things. So in terms of research, obviously we must respond as well, and we have to, I suppose, develop on our systems in a way that meets these challenges. So resilience is the term we use then for what we're trying to achieve. And it's important, the symbolism of this is important because I'd like you to understand the meaning of it. Resilience is an ecological term in science. Okay, it's about the study of plants and how they survive. And the plant that best represents resilience is actually on the bottom left there, it's the reed. Okay, so no farmer likes reeds, but in actual ecological terms, if you think of a storm, those plants will blow over in a storm, they'll bend, they're flexible and adaptable, and they return to their normal state once that storm has abated. People think of deep-rooted trees, but I mean, you know in a storm what happens, a deep-rooted tree just topples over. So it's about being flexible, adaptable, having systems that are flexible and adaptable that can meet the challenge that we face and return to essential function. And that essential function then is basically about profitable for farmers, delivering high-quality product in an environmentally sustainable way, and labor efficient, simple. So you're all running larger businesses now than you were 10 years ago. You've less time on your hands, and so the types of solutions we have for these challenges have to be simple and readily adaptable. They can't be complicated, because invariably complicated solutions, they don't really work. Hence the graphic, and hence the reason, I suppose, this is the only graphic really I'm showing over 2 days, and it's because of its importance. And the lads described it better than I'll describe it. It's about farming that grass growth curve. And by that they mean, that you're aligning animal requirements with that grass growth curve, utilizing that feed efficiently as possible, and on that basis then being profitable farmers to do that. We know from that point of view that that's going to maximize grass utilization and going to make for more profitable businesses for you this year and every year going ahead. And I suppose the second part of it is that it will allow you that you need to maintain low costs of production in order to harness the benefits of that system. If you're going to be a high cost production system by virtue of investments or spending on things, it's very difficult to be profitable grassland farmers because you cannot produce the product in the quantities that the high cost industries can. You will be unable to dilute the costs to the extent that these other industries can. So profitable grass-based farming, you have to buy into it in its entirety, and that means you have to have low production costs to make a good profit margin within the context of not investing in costs. And we know when we look at the international data, and this is an old study now done by my boss in Moorpark, Pat Dillon, but it shows us that, at the right-hand side of that curve are the grass-based industries, such as Ireland, New Zealand, and so on. And in course, including more grass in the diet in those industries has a big impact on your total cost of production. It really drives down costs. If you invest a lot in terms of fixed infrastructure, mechanization, and so on, things that shouldn't be part of a grazing system, then you will have high costs, and grass proportion in the diet has little impact on your total cost of production. So the challenge is there to keep the cost to a minimum while having functional systems at the same time. I suppose in the hindsight of 2018 and looking at the amount of feeding that went on farms, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, that supplementation last year doubled on most dairy farms. Such was the poor growing conditions. And it definitely permeates in terms of conversations now. How are we going to continue this year? Are we going to continue with that level of supplementation, or are we going to get back to what we were doing, I suppose, and producing milk from grass? I suppose you do need to be aware of kind of like the game you're playing, for lack of a better term. Like these rules have applied in grazing systems always, that if you want to increase animal intake in a grazing system, the easiest way to do it is to offer animals more feed, grass or concentrates or whatever. But there are diseconomies of scale in that. The more feed you offer a grazing animal, the less there will be its impact on the animal's intake and subsequently on its performance, because there's diseconomies of scale there. And there's a real kick in the teeth then, that as the more feed you offer a grazing animal, the lower is the utilization of that feed. So you can achieve very, very high intakes, and there have been studies showing grazing animals eating up to 25, 30 kilos of feed. But those same studies show that the utilization of feed drops. People used 80, 75% utilization here yesterday. utilization can drop way down, 30, 40, 50%, reflected in higher post-grazing residuals and so on. So this is the unique problem for a grazing system. You have to achieve a balance between achieving relatively high animal performance based on good allocation of high quality feed, but also at the same time utilizing all that feed, because you know the next time, if you don't utilize that feed, the next time you come back it's perishable, quality declines, and all of a sudden now you're in a vicious cycle of poor quality feed coming back because of underutilization. So it's a balance all the time. And if there was one thing I'd like you to take from the graph, it is that to increase animal intake by 1 kilo in a grazing system, on average, you need to offer an animal 4 kilos of extra feed. Such is the substitution effect that's so powerful in grazing systems. So you need to always bear that in mind in terms of trying to feed animals better in grazing. We want to do it. We want better quality swards, more efficient animals, and so on. But you have to be careful at the same time, because there is also that impact in the background. I suppose it's a slight on myself to say that, in terms of the environmental impacts of grasslands, I read pretty extensively in terms of literature and so on, but it's only when you look at European studies now that are coming through and the choices they've made and ploughing up permanent grasslands and putting in maize and so on to try and grow productivity in their systems, as has happened in many European countries, that you realize actually the full scientific story in terms of what happens in a grassland system. And to simplify that, I mean, your grazing systems in terms of retaining nutrients, sequestering carbon, acting as filters between, I suppose, the soils and water and so on, that they are the most efficient systems you can have. Okay, and that's really coming home to roost now in some countries throughout Europe. And I suppose I showed that graphic yesterday, and I really want people to be, farmers, you have to be so clear about this, that as a well-run grazing system with high levels of pasture utilization, that within that context you can have very, very environmentally sustainable systems, the best environmental sustainable systems. High levels of carbon sequestration, good biodiversity, no loss in terms of soil quality, and so on. So that's what we're aiming for, a medium level of intensity that gives us those environmental benefits while also being very, very profitable dairy farmers. I showed the stocking rate and I put it up again because it's so important. I'm not going to talk about it, we talked about it yesterday. But having an appropriate stocking rate is crucially important as grass-based dairy farmers. And this matrix to me describes best where you need to be. It's all about growing more grass and then stocking appropriately. The animal is a huge part of it. And, we do focus a lot, but one of our big successes, I think, as a dairy industry in Ireland, and in fairness, the UK as well, and other countries are increasingly turning around to look at animals in terms of robustness and, sustainable long-term animals rather than just about production. This is a study just produced in 2018, and it just shows you the indexes now that are around the world in terms of the kind of things that the various countries are selecting for. It's hard not to be kind of impressed with the detail in terms of those measurements, and I suppose every country now is selecting for more robust animals. And if you looked at the same data set from 10, 15 years ago, you would see that those same countries were at that stage probably selecting at about 2 to 1 in favor of production over robustness, health, fertility traits. So it really has swung around internationally now. Much bigger focus in terms of the fertility, the calving ease, the management traits, and so on. That the clear acknowledgement across all systems that they're driving for better profitability for their farmers. So a really good news story. And in Irish terms, I mean, I think we have one of the best indices in the world, and I think we have to acknowledge when we do well. And only in the last 12 months, Siobhan Ring in Moorpark has reviewed the commercial farm data and the impacts of EBI. And what she showed is that from 2000 when the index came in, I should point at this one, from 2000 when the index came in up to 2018, in terms of whether you're looking at fat and protein production and the BV for protein is there versus the actual on-farm gain in protein yield, whether you're looking at survival, calving interval, mastitis, we're improving now in all of these traits. That's fantastic. And the summary of that is that, between 2000 and 2017, the average cow now is producing 58 kilos of milk solids more than they did in 2000, and they're lasting for an extra half a lactation longer. So, that's good success, and I suppose we need to build even further on that. I would say probably we have more to do though. The average calving interval still, or the average calving rate in 6 weeks is still only about 60–65%. So we have a lot further to go in terms of selecting better animals, and I think we are making progress, but I suppose, don't lose sight that that's no point being complacent about the gains that we've made. The next one is in terms of white clover and its use. I suppose, again, now I'm pushing to the edge of where we are and where I think farmers need to look at. And I suppose I'm putting up the white clover here because in my mind we're talking about there's €500 of extra profit a hectare in play here for farmers that incorporate white clover in their farms. The study at Clonakilty is up there. The grass clover swards grew an extra 1.5 tons over the study period and produced an extra 50 kilos of milk solids per cow during the period. I can't think of anything else that you could implement in your farm that would give you that kind of, increase in animal performance, saving in terms of fertilizer cost. If you can cut out 100 kilos of nitrogen, that's straight away, that's €80 a hectare saved this year, given fertilizer prices. And the extra milk solids, then the extra 50 kilos of milk solids are a huge benefit in terms of overall receipts. So, the challenge is there for us. I think in terms of research, we have more to do. Not so much in terms of the bloat. I think good grazing managers now can manage bloat. I think the bigger issue is in terms of sustaining clover in swards, making sure it doesn't get to too high a proportion, that we can stabilize it at an average level so that we get these benefits in the long term, because there have been issues within the study in Clonakilty in terms of maintaining clover in sward. Putting it all together then, I suppose, in terms of the targets, where we are and where we'd like to get to. Economic breeding index, in terms of the average and where the target is for herds today, we're probably talking about double where the average herd is. Stocking rates increasing in line with grass growth, but up to 2.9 cows per hectare. Recalving rate, 63% in 2018. That should be closer to 90%, so lots to gain there. And pasture utilised, from 7.3 tonnes on average up to 13 tonnes potential utilised, and being utilised today on the best herd. So while I'm putting them up as targets, these are being realised on the best farms. By virtue of by achieving these levers and achieving these targets, it's very possible to achieve the type of figures Oliver Gorman talked about this morning of 1,350, 1,400 kilos of milk solids per hectare in the grazing system with low production costs, or €3 of total production costs. And on that basis then achieving the targets that we have of about €2,500 per hectare profitability at average milk prices. I suppose the other thing I want to mention in that, when we talk about the welfare of animals, or we talk about the carbon footprint, or any other aspect that we want to talk about, that the better farmers we have today, the top 10%, are halfway between the average and the target levels. So the direction of change on the best dairy farms is totally consistent with what we're talking about, and those farms are more profitable and more environmentally friendly in terms of how they're producing product. So the technology is working in terms of that, I suppose, those resilience targets that we have. Just looking ahead then in terms of improvement areas, in terms of the research program, and this is outside of my own work, this is more from the I suppose, Pat Dillon's area in terms of where we're selecting for and so on. There is still a big focus on breeding. Probably the next area for us now is in terms of animal health, that, in terms of the research that's done, we can see variability and heritability in terms of health traits. So selecting for disease resistance, lameness, mastitis, stress. These are things that are difficult to measure. They're not easily measured, and you don't measure them routinely on your farm. So I suppose we have to think of maybe some cleverer ways of capturing that information and trying to select for them in the future. Product quality, there's lots of information now. We know the technology even to profile products is improving all the time. And that gives us an opportunity to select even for better animals for producing better products in the future. The environmental load, feed intake, digestibility, and emissions. I suppose in terms of grazing systems, some people would say, well, do you invest in grazing systems in terms of reseeding or not? Or do you take what you have and, do something else? I suppose, from my mind, there's still a lot of scope to improve the productivity of grazing systems. And I suppose the first aspect of that will be evaluating swards under grazing rather than based on plots and so on. So Michael O'Donovan, using pasture-based now, is doing that to a large extent, looking at new cultivars under grazing on commercial farms, looking at their performance as a more realistic measure of what's possible. I think we have to reduce our reliance on chemical N. I think that's going to happen in the future, and I think we need to prepare for that. And I suppose mixed species, there are studies now showing that in New Zealand there was certainly, and some of the farmers probably came across the big influence of plantain in terms of farmers incorporating herbs and so on into their swards. Today I can't say the science is solid enough to say that those are going to be persistent, they're going to stay there and they'll operate at high levels. but the science certainly shows that they can significantly reduce nutrient losses and requirements for chemical N. So I would say that's a work in progress, but an area that we will be focusing on. There's a lot of focus on the environment, and I think we need to know more about our swards in terms of what exactly are we sequestering in terms of carbon, how are we utilising nutrients. There are studies in Ireland to show that, you know, when you plough up a paddock of permanent pasture, you lose about 30 tonnes of carbon, and that you could give anything from the next 30 to the next 60 years trying to get that carbon back into the system. So we know that permanent pasture lands work reasonably well, but we have more to do in terms of explaining how to manage it best for best results. And the large databases, whether it be pasture-based or some of the new smart data in terms of, I suppose, measuring things in grassland, sensors and so on, these things will help us to be better at grazing management in the future, and we can't ignore them. One big area, I think, and I'm very hopeful for, I suppose, we're lucky in Moore Park in that the research we do is more or less matched, you know, euro for euro with product research in terms of the food centre, and we have a relatively close relationship with them. And definitely I notice, looking at those scientists, the food scientists and so on, they're increasingly confident that they can profile milk. And I suppose the end game for this in my mind, whether it turns out or not, is that just like you get a cell count on every load of milk that you sell today, that in the future, you know, that text message will tell you a lot more about the raw material you're setting out the gate in terms of grassland composition, in terms of its nutritive value and so on. And I would be very hopeful that that will be the case, and that that will allow us to differentiate ourselves to an even greater extent in the future and deliver a higher value to farmers and a premium product in the marketplace. So that work is ongoing. I'd be very encouraged that there is potential there to do that. So to conclude then, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose, look, to put it in real terms and be pragmatic about it, the system we have is one of the best systems in terms of meeting the requirements and the challenges we face in terms of the environment, animal welfare, product quality, but also profitability for farmers. That's the real situation we're in. And there is areas where we can improve upon that, and I've identified those in terms of, I suppose, elite genetics, appropriate stocking rates, better pastures and so on, and new technologies are definitely going to play a role in the future. So we're not done in terms of the productivity of our systems. So I'll leave it at that, and we might come back to it in the questions.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Brendan. We're going to take a couple of questions for Brendan now before Nollaig takes the stage, because it's the topic of resilience, but we're kind of going to keep it focused on resilient systems and resilient people. So is there any questions for Brendan? Just when the microphones are going around, Brendan. Brendan, you gave us a great feel for kind of the future focus, you know, what might be built to improve in the future to become more resilient. What would you say would be the top 3 or 4 things you'd look for in a resilient business today, in terms of if you were meeting a farmer and trying to assess how resilient he was?
I think number 1 will be that they will have to be very, very profitable farms, because, you know, we'll have to continue to invest in our farms in terms of, yes, facilities, but in terms of, I suppose, just future-proofing our... I can't say today, and I think Michael Bateman's attitude to it is best, that we'll have to change in the future. And I'm sure being profitable and having a good, strong business will be the best kind of basis on which to meet the challenges that we'll face. So I suppose that's first up. Grassland, I mean, the more grazing that's incorporated in the animal's diet, the more we can show that, separate ourselves from other and show it. I mean, that's a very real advantage. And whether it be at farm level or whether it be in terms of science, I suppose, just underwriting that benefit and being able to communicate it through our processors, through our supply chains to customers, that's going to be the second thing. I'd say they'd be the 2 big ones if I was to pick out.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question down the middle here.
Is there any research being done? Our Achilles heel, it strikes me, is the methane issue. I was a bit upset to hear that we have John Roach saying we've got 0 sequestration of carbon. I hope that was going to bail us out a little bit. So what's being done? How can we argue our case on that one?
Okay, so I suppose as a starting point, as a grazing farmer, your ability to change diet is very, very limited. Okay, so, but there are in trial at the moment products out there that can be added to the diet in small quantity that can have significant effect on methanogens and on methane emissions. So those are very much in test state today, and I would say that, And some of those are showing up to 20, 30, 40% reduction in emissions. Okay, so it's possible. It'll have to be checked in terms of, I suppose, can it get into product? And we have to be careful about that this doesn't impact product and so on. So they're very much in test state. So those possibilities are there. But the challenge I would put back to you in terms of, as an industry, in terms of methane emissions, is that when you look at that average table, and nobody knows the average farmer, just like nobody has the average grass growth curve. Being top 10% versus being average is a massive difference in terms of methane emissions from your farm business. So if you can improve your EBI, improve your utilization, production and utilization of pasture, improve soil fertility, reduce the requirement for replacements, the footprint of the rearing business and so on, that's going to be significantly influencing your methane emissions from your farm business, and a great opportunity for you to be able to work on this in the shorter term.
So top 10% profit is top 10% environment as well. So it's
yeah.
a great way to differentiate yourself in both. Looking for questions? Brendan, it sort of goes into the area that Nullig is going to cover, but not quite. What are the skills to run a resilient farming business? What are the top skills that you think people need to be able to do to run a business that can be flexible and adapt, as you said there?
I suppose I think the lads covered it well in the last session, being really clear on what you want to achieve and having a clear strategy. I know, again, strategy, it sounds like such a meaningless word in some respects, but really clear about what works in terms of profitability, welfare in terms of sustainability, animals that last a long time in the business and so on, and just cleaning up practices and eliminating things that don't contribute to that basic direction. So I would say being clear about that. And how do you do that then? I suppose it's the conferences you go to, the groups you engage with, the people you surround yourself with, the information that you keep close at hand. They're the ways to keep clear on what you're doing.
Okay, a question here.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. One thing, automation. So reducing labour by automating certain things. So, for example, automatic sprayers on a rotary parlour. Does that have a place in a grass-based system, or is that an overcomplication?
Okay, so I'm naturally a cynic. Okay, you don't know me, so I'll have to put my cards on the table first. I think we have to be open to the idea that there will be some of these technologies that will become low cost and will be very effective to help us to reduce workload on our farms. And what they be, I don't think we can say today, but definitely in terms of there's possibilities there. And I suppose one of the nice things about an expanding industry has been there's a big focus now from technology providers on agri, on dairy and so on. So they're working harder to deliver solutions for you as well. So, I mean, teat sprayers and milk comparers, I don't know. I don't know about the specific technologies, but I don't think we can ignore it as an opportunity.
That nearly goes back, Brendan, to that point of having the skill set to actually evaluate what's making you more resilient 100%. And what's maybe added. Because you mentioned you can't overcapitalize as a grass-based business at the same time. Have I any more questions? Maybe one more before I have a question in front here, please.
Thank you. If I can ask a similar question again, but it's very important to us farmers because we're just doing our farm thing. But what actual trials are you doing at Moore Park in terms of the carbon issue? I mean, they're grazing trials, I take it, and how do you measure it through the parlour, is it just 21-day cycles, or are you doing more of a mob stocking herbal lay type things? We'd be very interested to know.
Yeah, okay, so I suppose in terms of the methane, a lot of the methane work it usually takes two forms. There's modelling work, which is trying to put together systems that will reduce the methane footprint. The MAC curve was published last year by Teagasc, which kind of recommends the basic technologies that will help to reduce our carbon footprint. So higher elite genetics, more focus on grazing. This is kind of like the modelling approach. In terms of the specific experiments, we always have a significant nutrition focus in terms of our research. So looking at what supplements can we add, when we add them, and what their impact are, both in terms of productivity and also in terms of, you know, nutrient use efficiency and including carbon. That's kind of ongoing, okay, and those feeds are changing over time. What else are we doing in terms of carbon? There's a lot of measurements in terms of swards and soils in terms of the carbon in those soils and how they're changing, but there isn't, I'll tell you now, there isn't a lot of science, international literature there to support us in terms of doing that. So I would say we're early stages in terms of a lot of that work. We have a big investment in terms of Solihead in a low carbon footprint system. And we're kind of, I suppose, we're looking at that information in terms of trying to explain how our carbon sequestration changes over time. But yeah, I suppose, yeah, it's an open space, to be honest with you, in terms of trying to do it.
I think it's a great question, and it almost highlights the importance of the Pasture Summit, Brendan, and this relationship between Ireland and New Zealand, as we're the only people that are going to do research on this topic.
Yeah. We're investing in, I suppose, I'm not giving you a good answer, and I'm conscious of that, and I suppose the higher productivity swards, if we can improve the yield of our swards by virtue of, you know, more efficient and so on, they're going to hoover up more nutrients, they're going to sequester more carbon. We've included clover in our swards now and have successfully adopted that. And I think that's a great opportunity, but equally there are these new herbs and so on that will even contribute more in terms of improving the footprint. So they are at an earlier stage, but I really in terms of carbon, just like any other nutrient, it'll be all about efficiencies and can you produce more with less, be it through the animal you have or through the grazing system that you're managing. So that's basically the focus for it.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Brendan. We're going to leave it at that for the system resilience questions for the minute, and I'll